Lisa and I had really been looking forward to our camping trip to Big Bend National Park. We were both drawn to the stark beauty of the desert landscape, the dramatic mountains, and the unparalleled stargazing opportunities. We'd chosen a remote campsite at Juniper Flats, known for its stunning panoramic views and its relative isolation. We arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, eager to escape the hustle of our normal lives and immerse ourselves in the quiet solitude of the Chihuahuan Desert. The drive-in was spectacular, the rugged mountains rising majestically in the distance. The air was dry and carried the unique scent of desert flora. Our campsite was even more secluded than we had anticipated, nestled amongst hardy juniper trees and prickly pear cacti. We set up our tent, the silence broken only by the occasional call of a bird and the gentle breeze rustling through the juniper branches. As the sun began to set, the desert landscape was bathed in a warm golden light, painting the mountains in hues of orange and purple. We cooked dinner over a small propane stove, enjoying the breathtaking views as the stars began to pepper the darkening sky. As darkness fully descended, the sky above us exploded into a dazzling display of stars. Far from any city lights, the Milky Way was a brilliant, shimmering band across the heavens. We built a small campfire, the crackling flames casting a warm glow on our faces as we sat in comfortable silence, simply soaking in the beauty of the night. Lisa was engrossed in a book she'd brought, its pages illuminated by the flickering firelight, while I lay back on our sleeping bags, my gaze fixed on the celestial spectacle above. A profound sense of peace settled over me, a feeling of being completely connected to the vastness of the universe. It was exactly the kind of escape we had both been yearning for. Without warning, the tranquility of the night was shattered by an unsettling sound. It came from the darkness beyond the warm circle of our campfire light. A strange, scraping noise that seemed to be moving through the rocky desert terrain. We both froze, our heads snapping towards the sound. Our peaceful reverie instantly replaced by a prickle of unease. The scraping stopped abruptly, and we exchanged nervous glances across the flickering flames. "Probably just a javelina," I whispered, trying to sound nonchalant, even though the sound didn't quite fit the image of the small, pig-like creatures that roamed the area. But then the scraping started again, closer this time, and it continued for a longer duration. It was definitely too heavy, too deliberate to be a javelina. It sounded like something much larger, something with weight to it. A shiver of apprehension ran down my spine. What could be making that sound out here in the middle of the night? Lisa slowly put down her book, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and intense curiosity. "What do you think it is?" she whispered back, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "I have no idea," I replied, my hand instinctively reaching for the heavy-duty flashlight from my pack, a sense of caution overriding my initial attempt at reassurance. I scanned around the blackness of the desert with the flashlight, but saw nothing. Then the scraping continued. It sounded like something was making a slow, methodical circuit around our campsite, always staying just at the edge of the darkness, tantalizingly out of reach of our campfire's glow. It felt like whatever was making the noise was aware of us, circling us, perhaps observing us from the shadows. The sound itself was unnerving, like fingernails dragging across rough stone, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Then, the scraping was accompanied by another sound, a low moan that seemed to emanate from the same direction. It wasn't the howl of a coyote or the cry of a mountain lion. This was different, a deep, drawn-out sound that resonated with a disturbing, almost human quality, yet twisted and distorted, filled with an undercurrent of pain and something else, something undeniably malevolent. Lisa gasped, her hand shooting out to grip my arm tightly. Her fingers dug into my skin, her knuckles white in the firelight. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. I don't know," I stammered, my heart pounding in my chest like a trapped bird. I kept the beam of the flashlight focused on the inky blackness surrounding our campsite, my eyes straining to penetrate the shadows, searching for any sign of what was out there. The moaning continued, a low, mournful wail that echoed through the stillness of the desert, interspersed with the unsettling scraping sound, slowly getting closer with each pass. It felt like it was tightening its invisible noose, getting ready to reveal itself. My mind raced, conjuring up images from old horror movies, none of them comforting. Suddenly, the scraping stopped right at the very edge of our campsite, just a few feet from the flickering flames of our fire. The silence that followed was heavy and thick, broken only by the ragged, uneven sound of heavy breathing. It sounded labored, almost asthmatic, and the air that drifted towards us carried a foul, sickly, sweet odor, like decaying meat left out in the sun. We both froze, our bodies rigid with terror, too afraid to move, too scared to even breathe. I kept the beam of the flashlight pointed in the direction of the sound, my thumb hovering over the on-off switch, ready to plunge us into darkness, if whatever it was decided to step into the light. The silence stretched, each second feeling like an eternity. Then, in the flickering firelight, just at the edge of the darkness, a pair of eyes reflected back at us, just for a fleeting, terrifying second. They weren't the eyes of any animal I recognized. They were too large, too wide, and they possessed an unsettling, almost intelligent gleam. They were eerily human-like in their shape and spacing, but they glowed with an unnatural, malevolent intensity that sent a jolt of pure fear through me. Lisa screamed, a high-pitched, piercing sound that echoed through the silent desert night, a raw expression of pure terror. The eyes vanished as quickly as they had appeared, and the heavy, ragged breathing abruptly stopped. For a long moment, there was only the sound of our own frantic breathing and the gentle crackling of the fire. Then, the scraping started again, this time moving away from our campsite, the disturbing moans slowly fading into the vast emptiness of the desert night. We stayed huddled together by the dwindling fire, too scared to even speak, our eyes wide and darting, until the first faint hint of dawn began to paint the eastern sky. In the cold, harsh light of morning, we cautiously ventured out of our tent. Circling our campsite were a series of strange tracks in the sandy soil, unlike anything we had ever seen before. They were large and vaguely three-toed, and they seemed to drag in the dirt, leaving a disturbed trail that led out into the surrounding wilderness. We packed up our camp with a frantic, unspoken urgency, our peaceful desert getaway having transformed into a terrifying encounter with something unknown and deeply unsettling. We never spoke of it to anyone, afraid they wouldn't believe us, or worse, that they would. But to this day, whenever I'm camping in a remote area, I can't help but listen a little more intently to the sounds that drift from the darkness beyond the comforting circle of the campfire light, always wondering what unseen things might be lurking just out of sight. Mark and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We were both burnt out from work and craved a weekend immersed in nature, far away from the city's noise and distractions. I'd found this amazing spot deep within the Angeles National Forest on a hiking forum. The pictures were stunning, a secluded clearing nestled amongst ancient pines, with a small stream babbling nearby. The reviews raved about the isolation and the incredible stargazing opportunities. We packed the car on Friday afternoon, our spirits high, eager for a weekend of peace and quiet. The drive up was beautiful, winding through mountain roads with breathtaking vistas at every turn. As we got further in, the crowds thinned, and the air grew cooler and crisper, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. We finally reached the trailhead just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the landscape. The last mile to the actual campsite was a bit rougher, a narrow dirt track that tested the suspension of my old Bronco. But when we finally arrived at the clearing, we knew the journey had been worth it. The campsite was even more beautiful than the pictures. Towering pine trees surrounded a small, grassy area, and the gentle murmur of a nearby stream provided a soothing soundtrack. The air was still and quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the light breeze. We quickly set about the task of pitching our tent, the fading light making the process a little more challenging, but also adding to the sense of adventure. Mark had the tent up in no time, while I busied myself gathering firewood. As darkness fully descended, we had a roaring campfire going, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. We cooked a simple meal of hot dogs and beans, the smoky aroma mingling with the fresh scent of the forest. We talked and laughed, enjoying the feeling of being completely disconnected from the world. Later, we lay back on our sleeping bags, gazing up at the most incredible display of stars I had ever seen. The Milky Way stretched across the inky black sky like a river of light, and the silence was so profound you could almost hear the universe breathing. It was exactly the peaceful escape we had both been craving. Eventually, the warmth of the fire and the long day caught up with us, and we crawled into our tent, the sounds of the forest lulling us to sleep. I woke up sometime later, the deep silence of the forest now feeling less peaceful and more absolute. It was a silence that pressed in on you, making you acutely aware of your isolation. My sleeping bag was surprisingly warm, cocooning me in a comfortable embrace. For a moment, I felt truly at peace, completely immersed in nature. But then, that feeling was abruptly shattered. A soft rustling sound broke the silence, originating from just outside the thin nylon walls of our tent. It was a subtle noise, easily dismissed as a small animal or the gentle stirring of the wind. I held my breath, straining my ears, trying to discern the source. The rustling stopped as suddenly as it had begun. I let out a slow breath, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me in the stillness of the night. But then, it came again. This time it was definitely closer. The sound of something moving through the dry leaves and underbrush was distinct, the scritch, scritch, right next to our tent. It was too rhythmic. It couldn't have been the random movement of the wind. My senses sharpened, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. What kind of creature was out there, so close to our vulnerable shelter? A curious raccoon? A stealthy coyote? Or something larger, something I didn't want to contemplate? I nudged Mark, who was still deeply asleep, his breathing slow and even. "Mark," I whispered, "did you hear that?" He mumbled something incoherent, a jumble of sounds that indicated he was still firmly in the land of dreams, and then promptly rolled over in his sleeping bag, his back now facing me. I sighed inwardly. Of course he was out cold. I was on my own with whatever was lurking outside. I lay there, my muscles tense, listening with intense concentration. The rustling continued its slow, methodical circuit around our tent. It truly felt like something was investigating us, circling our temporary haven, perhaps sniffing the air, trying to determine what lay within. My heart began to beat a little faster, a nervous flutter against my ribs. Then, the sound changed again, becoming even more unsettling. The rustling persisted, but now it was accompanied by a distinct thump every few seconds. It wasn't a violent impact, just a soft, almost hesitant nudge against the side of the tent, but enough to make the thin nylon fabric ripple and sway gently. It felt like something was testing our boundaries, probing our defenses. I was officially beyond freaked out. A cold wave of fear washed over me. I reached for my phone, fumbling in the dark for the familiar shape. My fingers finally found it, and I quickly activated its flashlight. The sudden beam of light cut through the darkness inside the tent, momentarily blinding me. I pointed it towards the wall where the thumping had originated, hoping to see a shadow or some indication of what was outside, but the nylon offered no clues. The thumping ceased for a brief moment, and I held my breath, a sliver of hope that whatever it was had lost interest and moved on. But then, a different sound emerged from the darkness, a soft, wet sniffing right by my head. It sounded like an animal's cold, damp nose pressed against the tent wall, just inches from my face. I could almost feel its breath, heavy and slightly fetid, through the thin layer of nylon. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to force myself to remain calm, to not give in to the rising panic. "Go away," I whispered into the darkness, my voice barely audible, a pathetic plea carried on the silent night air. The sniffing continued, a slow, deep inhale followed by a rushed exhale, followed by a low growl that felt like it rumbled through the ground beneath us. It was a deep, guttural sound that resonated in my chest, primal and undeniably menacing. That was no playful raccoon. This was something much larger, something with a predatory edge. I shook Mark more forcefully this time, grabbing his shoulder and giving him a good shove. "Mark, wake up! There's something really big outside." He finally stirred, groaning and swatting at my hand. "What? What is it?" he mumbled sleepily, still half lost in his dreams. "I don't know, but it's huge, and it's right outside the tent. It's growling," I hissed, my voice laced with urgency and fear. Just then the growling intensified, becoming a low, menacing rumble that vibrated through the tent floor. The tent shook slightly as something large brushed against the side, the fabric straining against the poles. We both froze, our eyes wide in the darkness, listening in absolute terror. The growling abruptly stopped, replaced once again by a series of heavy sniffs that circled the tent, each inhalation sounding wet and guttural. It felt like whatever it was still right there, just beyond our fragile barrier, trying to understand what kind of prey it had stumbled upon. The sniffing paused directly outside the entrance of the tent. We could hear it so clearly, just inches away from the thin zipper that was the only thing separating our vulnerable bodies from the unknown darkness of the forest. Then, the unthinkable happened. A sharp, tearing sound ripped through the silent night. The fabric of the tent near the zipper tore with a sickening rip, a long, jagged gash appearing in the nylon, allowing a sliver of moonlight to penetrate the darkness within. My phone went flying across the tent as we scrambled backwards, away from the gaping hole. We were both screaming a primal cry of fear that echoed through the stillness of the forest. Through the tear, illuminated by the faint moonlight filtering through the dense canopy of trees, I saw a dark shape right outside of where the tent was ripped. It was a massive silhouette towering over our small tent, filling the opening with an ominous darkness. I couldn't make out any distinct features, no light glinting off eyes or any discernible limbs, just a shadowy form that exuded a sense of raw power and unknown intent. The sheer size of it was terrifying. It remained there for what felt like an eternity, its presence radiating menace, sniffing at the tear in the tent, perhaps contemplating its next move. Then, with a heavy sigh that sounded strangely mournful, almost human in its depth, it slowly moved away, the rustling of leaves and the snapping of twigs gradually fading into the deeper silence of the forest. We lay there, huddled together, our hearts pounding in unison, too terrified to move, too afraid to even whisper. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig outside sent a fresh wave of fear through us. We didn't dare to even breathe too loudly. The image of that dark, immense shape looming over our tent was burned into my mind. We remained in that state of petrified silence until the first faint hint of dawn finally began to break through the trees, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. With the first sliver of light, we cautiously peeked outside, our eyes wide with apprehension. The ground around our tent was covered in large, muddy paw prints, far bigger than any coyote or raccoon we had ever seen. A tear in the fabric looked ragged, as if it had been made by something with incredibly sharp claws. We packed up our campsite with a frantic energy, our hands still trembling, our initial excitement completely replaced by a deep sense of unease. We never found out what it was that visited us that night, but the low growl and the sight of that massive dark shape outside our tent still creep into my thoughts, especially when the wind whispers through the trees at night.
Sarah and I had been looking forward to our camping trip to Pike National Forest in Colorado for weeks. We were both eager to escape the Arizona heat and spend a weekend hiking amongst the mountains and pine trees. We'd heard about a beautiful loop trail near Kenosha Pass that offered stunning views and a chance to see some wildlife. We packed our gear, excited for a few days of adventure in the crisp mountain air. The drive up was scenic, winding through mountain passes with breathtaking vistas of snow-capped peaks in the distance. As we gained elevation, the landscape transformed from desert scrub to lush forests of pine, fir, and vibrant aspen trees, their leaves shimmering like gold in the sunlight. We finally reached the trailhead on Friday morning, the air cool and carrying the invigorating scent of pine. We set off with enthusiasm, the trail winding gently through the trees, sunlight dappling through the leaves. The hike was everything we had hoped for. The views were incredible, with panoramic vistas of rolling mountains and vast forests stretching as far as the eye could see. We spotted deer grazing peacefully in meadows and heard the cheerful calls of mountain birds. The trail was well marked, and we made good time, enjoying the exercise and the beauty of our surroundings. After a few hours, we reached a point where the main loop trail intersected with a smaller, less defined path that seemed to lead deeper into a particularly beautiful grove of aspen trees. Their white bark stood out starkly against the darker pines, and their leaves rustled in the gentle breeze, creating a soothing, almost musical sound. We decided to venture off the main trail for a little while, wanting to immerse ourselves in the beauty of the aspen grove. We told each other we'd stick together and wouldn't go too far, just a short detour to take some pictures and enjoy the scenery. We wandered through the aspen grove, marveling at the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves, painting the forest floor in shifting patterns of light and shadow. The air was still and quiet, the only sound the gentle whisper of the wind through the leaves. It felt like we had entered a magical, secluded world. Sarah stopped to admire a patch of vibrant wildflowers, their colors a stark contrast to the white and green of the aspens. I continued walking just a little further ahead, wanting to get a better view of a particularly dense section of the grove. When I turned back to call Sarah over, she was gone. "Sarah?" I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. Only the rustling of leaves answered. I called again, louder this time, a knot of worry tightening in my stomach. Still nothing. The aspen trees, with their slender white trunks, all looked remarkably similar, creating a disorienting effect. I'd started walking back in the direction I thought we had come from, but the forest floor was covered in fallen leaves, and there were no clear footprints to follow. Panic began to bubble in my chest. We had only been a few feet apart. How could she have disappeared so quickly? I tried to stay calm, remembering basic hiking safety. Stay put. Make noise. Time passed, and I still hadn't heard any response to my calls. I decided I needed to try and find the main trail. Maybe she had the same idea and is waiting for me there. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long, eerie shadows that danced and swayed, making it even harder to get my bearings. "Sarah!" I yelled again, my voice cracking with fear. The only response was the whisper of the wind through the aspen leaves, a sound that now seemed mocking rather than soothing. I was completely alone, surrounded by hundreds of identical trees, with no idea which way to go. As dusk began to settle, the forest took on a different character. The shadows deepened and the air grew colder. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. Every snap of a twig made me jump. The cheerful calls of birds had been replaced by the more somber sounds of the forest at twilight. I tried to find a relatively sheltered spot to spend the night, huddling beneath the wide branches of a large pine tree at the edge of the aspen grove. The darkness descended quickly, and soon I was enveloped in a thick, inky blackness. The temperature plummeted and I shivered despite my layers. My phone continued to show no signal. In the darkness, the sounds of the forest were amplified, and every unfamiliar noise sent a jolt of fear through me. I heard the hooting of owls, the rustling of unseen creatures in the underbrush, and once, a chilling howl that sounded far too close for comfort. I had no idea what kind of wildlife roamed these mountains at night, but my imagination filled the darkness with all sorts of terrifying possibilities. I didn't sleep at all. I kept calling Sarah's name periodically. The only answer was the silence of the forest. The feeling of being utterly lost and alone in the vast wilderness was overwhelming, a crushing weight on my spirit. As the first hint of dawn finally began to paint the sky, casting a pale light through the trees, a weak sense of hope flickered within me. With the return of light, I could at least try to find my way back. I started walking again, in what I thought was the general direction of the main trail, trying to recognize any familiar landmarks, but the aspen grove seemed endless. I stumbled through the undergrowth, my legs aching, my throat dry. I was exhausted and starting to lose hope. Then I heard a faint shout in the distance. "Hello, is anyone there?" My heart leapt with hope. "Sarah!" I yelled back, my voice weak but filled with desperation. "I'm here, I'm lost," she yelled. The shouting came again, closer this time. I followed the sound, pushing through the dense aspen trees, and then I saw her, her face pale and streaked with tears, accompanied by a park ranger. It turned out Sarah had also gotten disoriented and had spent a terrifying night alone in the woods. She had managed to find a small stream and had followed it until she stumbled upon a small group who contacted the rangers. The wave of relief that washed over me was immense. We hugged each other tightly, both of us shaken but incredibly grateful to be found. We learned a harsh lesson that weekend. Even on seemingly easy trails, it's crucial to stay together and pay close attention to your surroundings. The beauty of the aspen trees had almost cost us dearly. The memory of that long, terrifying night lost among the silent, shimmering aspens still sends a shiver down my spine.